Wow, it has been a hot minute since I've made a video. Welcome back to myself, to y'all. I have been taking an unplanned impromptu break from YouTube as I did some traveling and some exploring, and oh my gosh, I have so much to tell y'all. I was in California for the last month and a half. It was a whirlwind of an experience. I had planned on making some videos along my journey, but there just was a lot happening, a lot going on, a lot of lessons I was learning, a lot of new experiences I was having. I'm still being really mindful of my health and where that's at right now, and I just didn't have capacity. So I gave myself radical permission to just kind of step back. But I do want to tell y'all more about that trip, but we're going to cover all of that in future videos. I am really seeking to give myself radical permission to be where I am at. And that is how I'm wanting to continue showing up in these videos with y'all, is to just show up as I am, which sometimes is unshowered, and that is being human. And I want this channel to be about being human. So I want to show up within radical authenticity in all forms. And that means really using this space as a place to explore where I'm at in the present. As I've talked about in a recent video, I am in recovery from what y'all might have heard referred to as adrenal fatigue, more specifically called HPA axis dysfunction, speaking to the hippocampus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenals. So it's a stress response system that we all have that I would hypothesize is like taxed for all of us living in this culture, in this society. But for myself, knowing where I'm at with my health, it feels really important to just be giving myself that grace. And even as I explore creative endeavors and putting my voice out there, I really want to be doing that from a sustainable lens. I really want to be working with my health and not against my health. If I'm working against my health, then I'm just kind of plugging back into the old systems of doing and being that I have been seeking to unplug from. So finding ways to work with my health means radical acceptance, radical authenticity, showing up and talking about what's real for me. And what's real for me right now are things along the lines, and that's what I want to talk about in this video, things along the lines of routines, habits, and addictions. So I've had some interesting life experiences. As if you've been following me along, you know, I was born and raised in Nebraska my whole life, didn't move outside of that state whatsoever, not even outside of the city where I was born, lived in the same house from when I was 20 to when I left Omaha at 33. I had everything, as you can imagine, like everything set up, everything planned out. Like I had really nested in that space. I'd really developed routines and habits in that space, some of which worked for me, some of which didn't work for me. So since 33, how old am I now? 36. So the past 3 years has been very different for me, has been a totally different contrast from the kind of life that I lived before. So over these past 3 years, I've had the experience of like uprooting myself and like putting myself in another situation for a while, putting myself in another situation for a while, putting myself in another situation for a while. I lived in New Mexico for 6 months, in a van in California, traveling for 6 months-ish. I lived on a land project out in rural California, a queer land project with radical fairies for a year. And so when I first moved here, I was again finding out, okay, like what are those routines? What are those habit patterns that serve me? What helps me? What allows me to feel functional in this space? So I'm able to tap into my creative center. So I'm able to tap into like a sense of power and control, but not in a controlling way of my life here. And so I felt like I was just kind of getting into a rhythm of what worked for me. And then I took off for a month and a half to live nomadically in California. In terms of making decisions for my health, that was not the best decision to have made. I definitely saw like a ramped up in sleep issues. Being in the city in a van is like stressful on the nervous system in general. So the way that I existed when I was in my van in San Francisco, you know, those were a very different set of like habits and patterns and a way of being that I established. I was around people all the time. I was sharing space with several other people in this house. Again, I was sleeping in my van, but I was, coming into contact. I was living more communally than I do when I'm here back in Kansas. And so I figured out what routines and what daily habits and what were things that supported my existence there, including, radical acceptance of like, I don't have space to make YouTube videos. And then I came back to Kansas. And so now I find myself, I've been back for about a week now, and I find myself in that process again of like, the habits and patterns and the daily ways of being that I experienced when I was in California don't translate here. So it's been having me, I've been thinking a lot about this. I've been reflecting on this. I've been watching specifically within myself how I struggle when I don't have like habits and routines. I tend to fall back on old coping mechanisms. And I've been like struggling with that a little bit, falling back into, we all are addicted in this society, in this culture. We all have addictions. Socially, we demonize some more than others. So we definitely demonize addictions to drugs and alcohol more than we do addictions to social media or television. But we live in an addicted society. We live in an addicted culture. That's part of the setup of white settler colonialism, capitalism. That is part of the design of keeping us mindless in this society, keeping us just going through the motions of supporting systems of capitalism and systems of oppression without critically reflecting why or what we're doing or how that's not working for ourselves and for the broader society. So I know I'm not alone in struggling with this, and that's why I want to talk about it. Also because I've had some of these experiences now to plant myself in different spaces and see how the ways that I'm engaging in routines and daily habits either help or hurt me. So the last couple days I've like really struggled here. I had like a really low crash day yesterday where I just felt sick all day. I didn't sleep well. I couldn't get myself back up to a place where I had energy to do things that I wanted to do. I was like real low baseline. And that happens periodically. I don't know if it's a function of HPA axis dysfunction or just like a part of me and being a sensitive person navigating in this society. I do find there are just kind of crash days every once in a while for myself. But I also know that my crash day yesterday and some of the struggles I've been having here recently are absolutely a result of the day-to-day habits and routines and choices that I'm making on like a minute-to-minute basis of how am I using my time and energy? Where am I directing my focus? Am I scrolling on my phone, or am I like sitting in stillness and being with myself and feeling the things that I need to feel that are within me? Am I trying to do something to escape that with television, with food, with cannabis? Am I doing things that distract me and take me out of my body and out of my experience? Or am I doing things that bring me closer to home, closer to being with myself? But I think this is a really interesting topic, and I want to talk about a couple specific parts of it. First of all, I know part of the reason that I struggle is because I have unplugged from the broader systems of our society. I have unplugged from the 9-to-5 operating system. I am no longer working a full-time job where I have a boss who's telling me what to do. I'm so grateful for that. Like, I did that for, from the time that I graduated high school in 2004, certainly after getting my bachelor's degree in social work in 2008. I've been working full-time, and most of that time I've also been a student. So my days were incredibly structured in what I call my old life. Like my days were incredibly structured. As a social worker, you don't really know what your days are gonna look like, but I knew what my routines were. I knew I was gonna go to work. I knew what my job entailed. I knew the kind of work I was gonna be doing. I had a very routinized way of being because I was usually also a student during that time. I always had that on the back burner too. So I always had it was like I always had other people telling me what to do. Bosses, teachers, systems and structures always telling me what to do. And that was what I wanted to break out of because I found it stifling and I think it's toxic on a broader scale. Yet there was also comfort within that. There was also guaranteed structure within that. There was also something easy about that where I just had to wake up and go through the motions. I didn't have to be the one who was necessarily calling the shots and like setting my agenda. When I left the workforce and went out on the road as a nomad, I found it took me a really long time to figure out what to do with that. that. And I think that's still a little bit of where I'm at right now. When we are socialized and raised in a society that dictates everything for us from the time we're born, we come into the world and our parents make those decisions, or whoever's raising us make those decisions. But as soon as we hit a certain age, we enter the elementary school system. And then our society does the socialization. Our society does the structuring. We're told from the time we're very young how we're supposed to be dealing, how we're supposed to be using our time every day, what it means to be productive. So when I first found myself in a space where there was nobody telling me what to do, it was the first time ever in my existence as a human being on earth where I didn't have somebody over me telling me what to do. And I think that's kind of a rare experience in this society. I was surprised at how challenging it was for me to figure out, how am I going to use my energy? How am I going to allocate my energy and my resources every single day? I thought it would be easier, that I was like, okay, I'm free now, broke free of the 9 to 5, whoop whoop, living the nomad life. And it wasn't like that. I really had to do a lot of internal work of like learning how to be present with myself, of learning how to fill my own time, of like reprogramming myself what it meant to do work. And there's a lot of empowerment in there, and privilege and luck, and that has been a huge blessing for me, but it has been an unexpected challenge. And I feel like it ties into some of these broader pieces I'm opening and tapping into with regard to routines, habits, and addiction, because we live in a society that has programmed us on how to routinize and habitualize our lives. So there's a couple books that I have been looking into again a bit this morning. This book, The Craving Mind, is one that I read earlier on in my awakening and movement out of the 9 to 5, out of traditional structures of work and ways of being. So this one I have read before and have been diving back into a little bit. Atomic Habits is a more recent book that more folks are familiar with, and I've just been touching into that one like a little bit. But I can see that the authors of both have reached very similar conclusions and have similar types of analysis of what it means to have routines and habits, and how those play out in ways in our lives that we're not aware of, that end up dictating how we feel on an everyday basis. Now, first of all, I don't know that I would necessarily recommend reading either of those books. What I don't like about them is they are both written by white cis men who have been traditionally successful in this capitalized, colonized society. So it's definitely coming from a very narrow worldview. And it's like academic jargon. It's like modern European philosophizing on concepts that I am sure are present and explored in other cultures across the world in probably more deep and meaningful ways. But these books are speaking a language that I understand, that I can read, that I can access, and therefore they've been helpful to me in thinking about this. So what's really fascinating, and what both of these books kind of conceptualize, is the subconscious ways that we are programmed by the things that we habitualize. So both talk about this idea that there is a trigger, behavior, and reward pattern that is programmed into us just because we are alive beings in this world. And that trigger, behavior, reward pattern is something we see reflected in animals and nature more broadly than just the human experience. Something happens, we see something, we feel a sensation, there's a trigger point. For example, I feel a hunger cue. That's a trigger point, that's an information point. That's like, I'm getting some sort of feedback from the environment that is registering within me as like, oh, I have this need, I have this desire. Then the behavior piece, I feel a hunger cue, I eat some food. That's the action that I'm taking as a result of experiencing that trigger. The reward piece is the feeling that we get after taking that action. Trigger, I feel a hunger pain. Behavior, I eat some food. Reward, I feel full. I feel satiated. I feel better than I did when I was feeling hunger pangs. So that's a pretty simple example. Let's make it relevant to this. Let's say instead of feeling a hunger cue, I feel a pang of something I don't want to experience. I feel a pang of loneliness. I feel a pang of stress. Pang? Is that the right word? Pang, sensation, whatever. I experience a sensation of loneliness. what is my behavioral response to that? Let's say my behavioral response is to log on to social media, scroll through Facebook, scroll through Instagram, whatever, check my page, check other people's pages. The reward I get from that is a dopamine hit from using technology. So now I'm establishing a very different sort of habit pattern. I feel lonely, I log onto social media, I get a dopamine hit. Feel lonely, social media, dopamine hit. Lonely, social media, dopamine hit. This is how something becomes a routine. I actually teach about this in my institutional oppression class too, because this works on a micro scale and it works on a macro scale. The things we do on a macro scale also become habitualized to the point we don't even think about them anymore. I'm not consciously thinking like, I feel lonely. I think going on social media will make me feel better. It becomes an automatic process within myself. Same thing with like hearing my phone buzz. That's a very common example too. I hear my phone buzz, that's a trigger. What's my behavior in that moment? Is my behavior to automatically check my phone every time I hear it buzz? If so, that becomes my routine. That becomes my habit. That becomes my auto response. Much like we learned with like Pavlov training dogs to drool. Other people have done this kind of conditioning process as well. This is very talked about and explored in psychology, but we program ourselves the same way. Phone buzz, check phone, dopamine hit. Phone buzzes, check phone, dopamine hit. And it gets to the point that I'm automatically checking my phone before I'm even consciously registering, like, do I want that in my experience at this moment? Because that's the challenge, right? Is that we live in a sick society. We live in a sick society that wants us to dissociate, that wants us to numb, that wants us to distract, that wants us to get those dopamine hits from the internet, from social media, from shopping, from television ads, from watching TV, from all these things. And the challenge is that it's those little moments, it's those little ways that we are responding to the triggers and cues in our society and the world around us and our environment. Those auto responses become part of who we are. Those auto responses program our brain and our body. So what I've noticed about myself is I've fallen away from a sense of mindfulness, which actually, let me share what the author of The Craving Mind describes as mindfulness, because I felt like this was a good, simple description. So he says, mindfulness is just about being interested in and getting close and personal with what is happening in our bodies and minds. Super simple. Mindfulness is, am I aware of what's happening within me and how that's directing the choices that I'm making? Am I aware of that habit loop playing out? Am I aware of that trigger behavior reward pattern that I'm subconsciously programming within myself, just like we program within dogs or other animals, rats, whatever you've learned about in psychology? The same thing happens for us on an every single day basis. And so what I've noticed for myself is I've been programming myself in unhelpful ways. I've been feeling something like loneliness. I've been feeling something like stress. I've been feeling something like exhaustion or not feeling well because my sleep has been flared up. And I've been turning to like, what are those immediate things that will get me that dopamine hit, that will get me that hit of like, can I just feel better right in this moment? But what that does is it programs me. Now, I have been really careful about having more boundaries with social media, more boundaries with like email and engagement with other people, and really seeking to stay within my own experience, because I know that's where I access my creative center. I know that's where my power is. I know that's how I reclaim my life and my sense of being a human in this world on my own terms and not on society's terms for me. And so I think that's why it's easy for me to see when I slip up, because that's not something I'm doing all the time. I'm not checking social media, just to continue that as an example, all the time. I've gone through huge periods of time where I don't check social media at all. And so I know what it feels like to be in those times where I'm not engaging in that particular behavior, pattern, impulse. And I know what it feels like when I am. And I can definitely see that part of the reason why I'm struggling here is because I'm playing that out, is because I've gotten into this habit of feeling the thing I don't want to feel, scrolling on social media, watching TV, doing something to escape it, feeling a temporary dopamine hit. But in the bigger picture, long run, it's making me feel worse, because that's the thing about this behavior pattern. When it becomes routinized, when it becomes something we repeat and repeat and repeat, and not just like a one-time or a two-time thing, it programs our brains. It becomes a subconscious craving. Like, that's what the craving mind is all about. It's how we have gotten into this state of craving, like from cigarettes to smartphones to love, why we get hooked and how we can break bad habits. That's what the descriptor of this book is. So we crave drugs. I would say our smartphones are a drug too. I would say love can be a drug too. So we crave these drugs as a way of automatically, immediately coping with what we're feeling in that moment. And we feel a little better as a result of that right in that moment. But on a larger scale, we're disconnecting from ourselves. On a larger scale, we're getting sucked up into these coping mechanisms that, for myself, leave me feeling really shitty and leave me in a state where I have to try and work even harder to get myself back to a place of feeling good. Because over time, these habits become worldviews. Over time, these habits become who we are as people and how we show up in the world. Are we chronically dissociated from our bodies, from our sense of self, because we are spinning out into addiction cycles? That ultimately ends up becoming our entire way of being, if so. And to me, this explains why we live in a culture of such unhappiness and such high addiction levels in this country, because our programming from broader society encourages us to do this, encourages us to engage and routinize these habit patterns that turn into autopilot, that end up chronically disconnecting us from our sense of self, our sense of power, our sense of source, our sense of spirituality. So in Atomic Habits, the author talks about habits are mental shortcuts learned from experience. And he also says, habits do not restrict freedom, they create it. The way that we set ourselves up to autopilot, to go through our day-to-day experience in life, is either sending us on a direction that is aligning us with who we are, aligning us with our deeper sense of self, or that's disconnecting us. So like I said, I've only just begun to explore this book. And this one, the author does talk about some specific strategies of shifting habits, using small steps, doing things to make the habits we're trying to change less available and less easy to rehabituate, and making the habits that we do want to lean towards easier, more immediate, more rewarding for us to choose. So that's where I'm finding myself right now, is thinking a lot about routines, habits, and addictions, and how routines and habits have shaped my existence and my sense of self and my way of being in the world throughout my life. What it means now that I'm in a place where I get to choose on a daily basis. Like, I could do anything, and that's wonderful and a huge blessing and a huge privilege, and also overwhelming, and can be difficult when we have grown up in a society that structures that for us. It makes me think about my work with the foster care system. I focused a lot of my efforts on young people who were aging out of the foster care system when I was in the field. And what I saw and what we knew, especially when I was working to improve the ways that young people aged out of the foster care system, or rather improve the structures that were aging young people out of the system. Of course, if a young person has grown up in the foster care system and had very little freedom, lived in a group home, lived in some space where somebody is telling them what to do 24/7, they have school, they go home, they have very clear structure that somebody else is giving them for their day. What we saw is that then when they left that foster care system, when they aged out, and suddenly it went from total structure, total control by the state, by the government, by the group home, by whoever, into total freedom and no more support, good luck, you're out on your own. That's a huge contrast to be able to figure out how to set those structures and set those habits and patterns for oneself when we've been so conditioned by other people telling us what to do. We haven't even learned how to do that for ourselves. So there's a huge learning curve that comes, and there's developmental milestones that have been missed as a result of that. And that's collectively true for us when we live in a society that doesn't structure us to make those kinds of empowered choices, that doesn't program us to be independent. We live in a society that programs us to be very dependent upon money, dependent upon jobs, dependent upon grocery stores, dependent upon capitalism, dependent upon shopping, dependent upon the internet, dependent upon television, dependent upon alcohol, dependent upon cigarettes. Oh, I could go on and on and on, right? We live in a very addicted society. And that is because we have to be in order to exist and survive within the level of capitalism, colonialism, and control that we have constructed in this culture. Now that's kind of a lot. I'm gearing this video down. I'm not trying to ramp back up, but There's also empowerment in recognizing that, because only through realizing the way that our society and structures have been built around us, like only through realizing how lost we've been in our own trigger behavior reward patterns that we're not even necessarily aware of, that we're consciously choosing on a day-to-day basis, only when we have awareness can we stop. Only when I have mindfulness and awareness can I realize, like, oh shit, I don't actually want to program myself to be auto-scrolling on social media as a temporary coping mechanism when I feel these bad feelings, because what I know is that in the long run, that's going to serve me less. And I'm actually just going to reinforce my addiction to this device every single time I do it. So that awareness allows me a different choice. That awareness allows me at least like okay, I'm feeling this feeling, I'm having this craving. Let me pause, let me observe, let me see if there's something else I can do with this instead of going back to the same habit pattern that I was autopiloting. And I think like that's the biggest thing that I want y'all to take away from this video, for myself as well, is just an awareness and a realization that it's really the little choices that we make every single day that are programming ourselves. We are programming ourselves. There's ways we're being programmed by society that we can't help. I mean, we can choose not to watch commercials, we can choose not to listen to radio ads, we can choose to have a lot of boundaries with news media sources, which I recommend all of those things. But there are certain things that we can't control. We can't control that we have to move through an education system that colonizes us. We can't control that we have to exist in a society that is deeply colonized, where anytime I go out into the world around me, even just going to the grocery store, even walking down my street, I'm seeing things that are reinforcing, that are reprogramming me to be a colonized person, to be a colonized human in a colonized society. A lot of that we can't control, we can't help, we can't change right now. What we do have control over are the choices that we ourselves are making about how we program ourselves. When I experience a trigger, when I experience a cue, when I experience something that makes me want to do a behavior, that makes me want to take an action, makes me want to smoke a cigarette, makes me want to turn on my television, makes me want to open up Facebook, makes me want to check my texts, am I holding awareness? Am I holding awareness of when X happens, then I do Y. When X happens, then I do Y. This is how we consciously program or unprogram ourselves. What is it that I actually want to do when I feel those feelings? I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying you're going to be able to listen to what I'm saying here and like automatically change the way that you're doing these things. Let's not delude ourselves that any of this is simple. I'm certainly not saying that. Like, obviously, I am struggling myself as well with how to shift some of these pieces in a way that is programming myself in an intentional, conscious way instead of subconsciously reinforcing shitty old coping mechanisms and addictive patterns and cycles. It does start somewhere though. And what I have seen about change in general over these last several many years of a whole lot of change for myself is that awareness is that first step. Awareness is sometimes the most important thing. Usually when I start to have awareness about something, that thing starts to shift naturally on its own because I'm just having that awareness. So my hope and desire and intention for myself is that by making this video, that by sitting down and having some of these realizations and reflecting on my own experiences and delving into content related to behavior change and habit patterns and how I can work with those things to support my growth and progress instead of holding myself back. Like, that's really where I'm at right now. That's really what I'm exploring. That's what's real for me in my environment right now. I am back here in Kansas and I have the opportunity to reestablish my routines now that they've been thrown off from my travels. And as I am reestablishing those routines and thinking about how can I create a day that supports my growth, you know, these are all pieces that are coming into mind. So I'm delving into these books. I'm delving into my own inner realms. I'm sharing what I'm learning with all of y'all, and I will continue to do so as I go, as I grow. All right, y'all, wishing you a very happy July. I will share more videos as I am able to and inspired to do so, and I am sending my love to you. Till next time.